Weekly online podcast. We are the VUU, and we're thrilled that you all are here to join us. Today, we have members of the Commission on Institutional Change to talk about the forthcoming report that will help rock our UU world. I'm excited about it. I can't wait. But first, we have our regular check-in from our hosts. I am Cristina Rivera. I'm coming to you from Charlottesville, Virginia. It's beautiful. We're very excited to see spring sprung. It's also causing some tension with social distancing, but we're just all kind of hanging in there. We are part of the set of governors that are going to start to try and reopen next week, or actually this week. So we'll see how that goes. Meg, how's it going in your world?
Hi, Meg Riley here in Minneapolis. We're still pretty much on homestay till middle of the month, although they just yesterday opened up things like dentists, which I'm excited about, having had a couple of postponements there. But yeah, it's been gorgeous here. I have a good friend I talked to in Chicago. It's consistently warmer here, and that's just weird. And yeah, my garden is about half mulched, and I've got the cold weather stuff in, but the little stuff I still have to bring in at night and take out in the day, like a little day camp. Aisha, how are you out there with the killer?
Yes, I'm Aisha Hauser in Seattle, Washington, the state that brought you the first confirmed cases of COVID, now brings you murder hornets. You're welcome. So it is sunny and spring, and I did, thank you, Jude Geiger, a friend of mine, let me know that praying mantises attack murder hornets. So I will be looking up how to get those. So that's me. Michael.
Good morning, everyone. Greetings from Peekskill, New York. Just a little north of New York City here, and it's a beautiful, beautiful spring day. I hope to spend some time outside this afternoon. I don't know what there is to say. I have praying mantis eggs in my garden. I wish I could get you some. But the praying mantises are thriving around my house, and so the murder hornets will not come near me. And my governor is smarter than your governor. Except maybe Leslie, who's in California.
Mine's smart too. I'm Washington. The West Coast people got it going.
And we're not reopening anything in New York for a little while, and we have there are 7 criteria that have been set here in the Northeast for starting a 4-part process to reopen, and none of the 10 regions of New York State meet all 7 criteria right now. So at some point, like maybe 2 or 3 weeks from now, the Adirondack Mountains might reopen. But that's like, Canada reopening. That's such a different world from where I am that it's like might as well be a different state. And life is okay here at Raymond Street Elementary School, where I am the sole first grade special education teacher. Good morning, Antonia. How are things where you are?
I'm doing well. It looks like we have sun, so we are going to make sure everybody gets some vitamin D today outside, because they got to go outside. I thought we had a governor that was about keeping people safe, but we are starting a restricted reopening tomorrow because we need to retail shop curbside, I guess. So we are holding it down in the fort, and we'll see what happens. But other than that, things are going pretty well. We have converted our dining room into a cubicle station. They will know how to work in cubicles by the time they get to be adults, it seems. And I am here on YouTube, and I'm getting your information that you want to ask to the host and to the guest. So please talk to us. We'll be very happy to hear from you. And this should be a very lively, informational view today. Back to you, Aisha, Christina.
So for our UU roundup this week, I wanted to give a shout out to all of the candidating processes that are going on in congregations. Shout outs to the congregations that are calling ministers, religious educators, like there's all sorts of calling and settling and hiring going on right now. And also just a shout out to the folks that are part of that process that don't quite make a match. It's really, really hard, and trying to do it virtually in most cases is also extraordinarily difficult. So just, keep the faith, you all. It's going to happen. I saw I think my first virtual online ordinations this week, and it was beautiful and sad too. Like, there was moments of loss and grief to not be able to be there. And finally, I'll do a shout out to all the bridgers. My sons bridged this weekend in a bittersweet virtual, sitting on our sofa watching it. And that's going to be, the reality for a lot of our bridgers. And it's just a precursor to the non-graduations that a lot of these young people are going to have. And it's just really rough. I noticed in our house, it's really hitting us this week, how rough it is. So just lots of love to y'all. It's hard, and we know it's hard, and it's okay to feel it. So Meg, you wanted to circle us to UU the vote.
Well, I wanted to mention UU Share the Check, which is coming out also of the UUA, encouraging those of us with the privilege of having enough to donate the $1,200 stimulus check to marginalized communities. And so it's hashtag UU Share the Check, and you can register and share where you're giving it, because they really want to get a sense of what we're doing together. And they have some suggested organizations, including the bailout folks that we had on last week, which, as you know, is my choice. And what I'm doing with my stimulus check is just in time for Mother's Day, reuniting some families. But, for some people, I know it's impossible, and that money is life-saving. So those folks should hold on to it. But for those of us with more privilege, it's an opportunity to share what we've got, understanding, as we do at the cellular level right now, how radically interconnected we are as a people. So I wanted to lift that up. I also wanted to just shout out, CLF did a fundraiser Tuesday for Give Tuesday Now. I don't know, some gimmicky thing. I just want to thank all the people who gave. We had a $6,000 goal, and we actually made $8,000, which is fabulous. As I said, I'm getting ready to leave, and I really want to leave this in good hands for the people who come in. So that just felt really good. The generosity of people. I just want to thank anybody who did give to that and who supports the CLF and programs like this. So thank you. That's what I got.
Thanks, everyone. Anyone else? I don't think there was. Okay. So we are thrilled to welcome back members of the Commission on Institutional Change. Today we have Sir Lebert Jr., who is a board trustee at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Akron. Yay! And owner of Conjure Comics, a comic book publisher focused on justice, liberation, and equity. I have to check that out. I did not know that. For some reason, I didn't read that in your last bio. I am so all over that. I can't wait. We have Dr. Elias Ortega, who is president of Meadville Lombard Theological School and a member of the commission. And we have the Reverend Leslie Takahashi, who serves as lead minister at the Mount Diablo Unitarian Universalist Church in Walnut Creek, California, and is chair of the commission. And she's also co-author of The Arc of the Universe is Long. If y'all haven't had a chance to read that, it's like just one of the best reads that you can get right now in Unitarian Universalism. And will give you just some base work for, what the work that the commission is doing. And you can kind of see how that arc is shifting. And in a little while, I think Reverend Dr. Natalie Fenmore might be joining us. She's minister at a minister for lifespan religious education at the UU congregation in Shelter Rock. And she's a former president of Loretta. I think that brings us to Sarah. You're gonna launch us, are you not?
Yes, and good morning. Thank you for having me. And, I'm drawn to open with a quote, and it actually comes from a post from Reverend Leslie about our kind of lack of collective mourning. And it felt really appropriate today as I looked over the numbers of the death rate within the Black community is due to COVID-19. Despite being only 13% of the US population, we are 60% of the coronavirus deaths. And I know that many of us have people who are sick, many of us have lost friends and family members to this. And I know there's a lot of people in our community as UUs and in our wider community who are really suffering. So I'd just like to lift up this quote from Ossie Davis, actor, director, poet, and civil rights activist. "We have been to hell and back again, and death cannot have the final word." So I've been invited today to talk about our report and about our process leading into it. And it really began, a starting point for us, I should say, was a convening hosted in Atlanta in 2017 by UUA co-presidents, Reverend Sophia Betancourt, Dr. Leon Spencer, and Reverend William Singford. This is the first convening designed to capture many of the ideas that have been readily available and yet ignored about how to combat white supremacy culture and the marginalization of Black, Indigenous voices and voices of color within the many expressions of our faith. What was asked for at the convening was a process of truth and reconciliation. And the Commission on Institutional Change has served as the beginning of that process. So this was a board mandated commission. We were originally given a charge of 2 years, which was then extended to 3. And our process has been, first we did a call for testimony. So we issued a call first, and then we actually repeated that several times throughout our work to start collecting data. So this came from people of color, from those who are white allies, those who are, we took a call from folks who maybe felt that they were either on the opposite end of the spectrum and feeling that this work was necessary. And we really just wanted to do as wide of a range of, to gather as much information as possible. We did focus groups, which were convened at the 2018 and 2019 General Assemblies. And these were designed to elicit feedback and kind of give people a chance to really talk out what their experiences were within their own congregations. In the fall of 2018, under the leadership of consultant Melvin Bray, we convened a multi-day gathering of those who had been leading work on equity, inclusion, and diversity. This was our collaboratory. It was one of the best experiences that I think I've had. It was a great opportunity to kind of pick the brains of those in our faith who are really working on this and have really put so much of their lives into it. We also contracted an outside organization called Visions, Inc. And we asked them to do a really intense audit of just our association's leadership structures and really the systems that we had in place. And then out of that, we used kind of a really cool program called Deduce, which is a cross-platform research program for social science. And we gathered all of this information, which amounted to over 650 pages of transcripts and 80+ hours of audio video interviews. And that has become, after all these years, our report, which is, I would say, and it repeats it again in the report, that it is a summation of some of our work. Of course, the complete range of our history and experiences can't be captured within just one book. However, we feel that this is as thorough a report that we could put out, and we hope that it answers the call and especially the need for a guide on change. One of the biggest obstacles we faced as a commission was the weariness that people had within our congregations, within our faith community around the kind of continued conversation and continued process over the last few decades around changing these systemic oppressions. This is not our first rodeo, and yet we hope that this report can maybe be our last attempt at that. And we want to see that this becomes a guide for moving forward, both within these times, and that it can be used as a tool for those folks who are within their congregations who are struggling for change, and also for our leaders, the incoming administrations, that they would have this as a reference. Because one of the things we found too is that the information, and I guess I should say the data, was lacking in some areas, and around just the experiences of people of color within our religious professionals, the rates of hiring and firing, and all kinds of things. So we really hope that this becomes a very strong kind of core document to be used. And I also want to point out the just great and effective leadership of our co-moderators, Mr. Barb Grieve and Elandria Williams, and the wonderful board of trustees who did so much work to push this report through. And of course, our president, Reverend Susan, and our vice president, Carrie McDonald. Their leadership has been courageous, historical, and I think that as UUs, we should all be very, very proud of that.
You all might not be able to answer this question yet, but I want to reflect back what I heard you say, sir, in terms of that this isn't our first rodeo. And often we hear from the religious professional of color community that we're, and the UU by POC community, that we're still talking about the same things that we've been talking about for decades. Like, we're still dealing with some of the same issues that we've been dealing with decades, and we've had reports over time that have, pointed these things out. And so I'm wondering how you all envision this report being used differently or making a different kind of impact, because I think it's poised to do that. And I've heard from you all a little bit about that. And so, like I said, it might not be a conversation for today's show, maybe the last time you're here, but would you all have something?
I mean, I would love to chime in on that and invite other folks too as well. But I think that's a really important point, Christina, because one of the things we said to the board when we met with the board 2 weekends ago was that, this is not just, we have worked, I think we can honestly say that we have worked as diligently at this as we could do. And that doesn't mean we've done a perfect job, but it means we've taken this very seriously. However, with that being the case, this is not just our report. This is the report of the, 1,100 basically people who participated in this, some of whom at great personal cost, because to go back through the events that some people retraced for us, it is actually about, and you're aware of this personally, but it's about re-stimulating trauma. And there's actually a physical, like we had people get physically sick after talking to us. We had people have other issues, mental health and other issues after talking to us and retracing things that were difficult. So then we went back and tried to make our protocols more trauma informed. There are things that we had to do, but even with that, people paid a huge cost to participate and to name their truths yet again, for some of them, for multiple times. And I don't want to make this be too heavy, but I do want to say that the report, ironically, is really what keeps me up at night, and is the idea that we could not honor we personally put our integrity on the line, saying we will make sure that this report doesn't just sit on a shelf, that this, and there are over 90 specific actions in this report. And we're not saying that every one of those specific actions is going to happen, but there are some of them we've put a lot of time into. And I think what's important to make this go forward are a couple things. So I am going to answer that, and I'll answer it every show we're on if you want, because I think it's so important, you know, like I'll just keep saying it over again. My dogs are certainly tired of hearing me say it. But the thing that I would say is that, you know, we need to make sure that there is an ongoing structure similar to the commission, maybe not at the resource level, but something that is both doing the monitoring and the proactive engagement and partnership. I mean, that's something that I think is really important. Sir mentioned the administration and the board, and we have worked with them in ongoing partnership, not just sitting, observing, and then issuing a report at the end. We did choose to issue a report because we realized we had amassed a lot of real news as opposed to fake news, and it was important to document that. And so we put it in this report. But it is important that we have some kind of body that keeps monitoring that. And it's also important that we have ongoing conversation as those of us that are phasing out as of July 1st, that we have ongoing conversation with those who will implement this to make sure that they hear the reasons why we came down on certain things, because we took this collective brain trust from the Black, Indigenous, people of color community, and we put it together in this report, but we did it with some discernment, and there are reasons for that. And it's really important that people hear those, take it seriously. You know, the irony is this really is, as we said the last time we were here, kind of the blueprint for what we should be doing in this world we're in now. And the irony is the crisis that we're in, where everyone's just trying to like get the basics done, could mean that we actually ignore this report, which would be really a moral travesty, honestly. So I might have strong feelings about this, you know.
I think we need to have strong feelings about it, and I really appreciate the integrity with which the commission is holding, you know, not wanting the report to sit on the shelf. And I think that, you know, an outcome that would be, yeah, a travesty would be that you all feel like you're the only ones that have that responsibility, because it's every UU's responsibility to make sure that this report doesn't sit on the shelf. And the commission has put, you know, just everything, you know, personally on the table. We've had, you know, commissioners that have, you know, been there the entire time. We've had commissioners who've had to, you know, leave for various reasons. And, you know, to not honor the sacrifice that all the commissioners have made by leaving it up to you all to make sure that this just doesn't sit on the shelf would just be not in keeping with our faith. I mean, I think that's, for me, the bottom line of why we need folks to really pick up on this when it is released, and make sure that they are carrying it forward. We are Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations, and those congregations are responsible for the covenant that we hold within each other. So we have a couple of questions in the chat that come up each time. So if we can just say again how the report will be distributed.
So we have also been very careful stewards of the money that was given to us to implement this report. And one of the things that we have money now that we will be spending will be to make sure that a physical copy of this report will be sent to every congregation. It will also be available in other forms. And right now, I mean, ironically, we were trying to make sure that a physical copy of this report would be sent to every congregation. And now that's really not very helpful, because it'll sit in a mailbox in a lot of places, we hope. But we also will be releasing the report. Sir and I spent the weekend doing one more final big read of the report, and it is now really close to going off to be printed. So there will be some form. We're talking now about how to release it in a non-physical report way, but it will be available, but we hope just before GA, and then we'll be talking about it more at GA. So, but a physical copy will be at every congregation, and it's really important for people that are advocates, allies, accomplices, you know, BIPOC people, to know that there is a copy somewhere in your structure, so you should find out where that is. And there's a question in the chat too about whether it could be made available from video audio formats, and I think that's something we definitely need to look into. So thanks for that suggestion.
Also, I'd want to add that the actual testimonies we took in, those themselves will be held from the public, as they're sensitive kind of personal information. So the recordings, documents, and other materials will be held for a period of 5 years, after which the data will be available for academic use. And those would be like the specific testimonies that were shared.
I wanted to say I was part of that October meeting that was extraordinary in many, many ways. I wonder, and this is a question, if one of the differences between this report and say other reports or Commission on Appraisal reports in the past is the deep dive and how personal interviews were much more, it was wide. I mean, you cast a wide net. And I guess the question, and maybe it's a hope, is that will make a difference because, in addition to hundreds of other things that you all did, but I wonder if hopefully hearing from, because the other thing is people were afraid because the system was set up to punish people, we know this, who spoke out, right? And that was, I think, the intention of the commission after the 2017, the events of the spring of 2017, is to name, people need to be able to talk about what happened to them without fear of retribution. So I don't know where my question went. Oh, do you think the personal, the fact that people were given an opportunity to tell their story, will that make a difference?
We hope so, right? I think we hope so. We aiming for that. I think, and for me personally, I can say that this cut in different ways. One, it generated a lot more conversation, right, around folks, both not only in folks who were willing to step forward, right, and share the stories with us, either publicly or privately, but also the conversation around folks who were public around having been done this before once or twice and nothing happened, right, that enter into the public memory, right, of some of those conversations, as well as those who are saying they were not going to participate for the reasons that you, right, the fear for the backlash. And we, as best as possible, right, we documented those instances as well, right, if not attached to people necessarily, but have that record in our files. I think what that also generated among us is just a larger conversation that is implanted in the system as a memory, right? So now you have one of the, I think collectively the commission grieve is really finding out the extent of the folks that we have lost to this reality, right? Over 1,000 folks of color over the last 20, 30 years or so, which at the face of the movement will be very different when we think about that lost. And now some of those stories are back circulating again among us, right, as a historical memory that we can then, pass on to the current and next generation as a conversation of change. I think that will have an impact.
I hope too that folks can share and something that really inspired me working on the report was that this is sacred work. Our lived experiences are part of our sources. And these lived experiences that folks brought to the table and shared with us are deep and from the heart. And I hope that we can honor that with the change and that folks can see that sharing as part of the sacred. And I use that as an atheist. That's one of my, our storytelling and our capacity to tell stories is such a key part of us being human that I hope folks can really dig into how important that work was.
Well, and I think that just to reflect back to you some observations from someone. I mean, I have not been directly involved in this process, but I'm involved in lots of places around Unitarian Universalism, and so just I think I hope it feels good to hear that the way in which you all have bridged the personal stories and the institutional change, I think has been really powerful to many people that I've come into contact with. That it could have just been could have just been personal stories, or could have just been institutional, and you connected them in a way that I think is very powerful. And I haven't read the report yet, but I've just been appointed to the Ministerial Fellowship Committee, for example, and we are eagerly awaiting the section of your report that has recommendations for changes to ministerial fellowship and ready to implement them. And so I came into a system that felt that where the people felt listened to and engaged with and inspired to do the work that you were about to task us with doing, which I think is important. And I hope that I wanted to give you that feedback just because there are people inspired to do the work that you're about to ask us to do, even though we haven't read the actual report yet.
Well, it's hard to read the actual book because we're still getting it done.
And my future self wants to just say that for me and Charles coming into the co-moderator position next, we're really seeing this as the blueprint of what we're going to be doing. I mean, that I think without it, we would feel much more hesitant to walk in, but it feels like the board, as you say, is committed, and the administration. And to me, last GA, when Reverend Marta, who we see is watching today, shout out to Marta, called up all the leaders who are people of color to the stage, I just wept. I thought, we're in a different time. We're in a different time than we have been, and we have a shot. We have a shot at this. And if we don't screw it up again, we really could become who we say we want to become. And that is so exciting to me.
Yeah, I think leading to that, one of the questions that we have in the chat are some of the 90 actions that Reverend Leslie referenced, ones that can be implemented at the congregational level. Can my congregation's 8th Principle Task Force look at it as a compass? And yeah, I just see huge nods going on right now from the commissioners. I can't imagine that there wouldn't be multiple points of entry for our congregations.
Yeah, and we actually went through, and then after we did, we actually went through and made sure that there were very clear on-ramps for every one of our 10 areas of recommendations that are congregationally focused. And we didn't label them as such, but it's pretty clear where that is. And there's a whole section on congregations. There's a whole section on hospitality. And I think that's really important. And I want to take a step back, if I could, just for what Michael said about the bridge between personal stories and systemic change, because I think this is a place where we get caught as Unitarian Universalists over and over again. So I just want to take this moment, because I think this is one of the things that will matter about implementation. And that is that, we are really good at, this is one of the reasons people didn't want to tell their stories again, that we'll hear people's stories, and I don't want to be dismissive. I think it's a real response. It's a human response. We'll be, we'll hear them, we'll be empathetic, and, there'll be tears, there'll be, self-recriminations, but then nothing systemically changes, right? The systems stay the same. And just in the same way that we want to be personally, like we want our institutions to be personally responsible to individuals. We want Elias to be the person of color to whom we are responsible for. Like we've got to move it to a different level where we have structural accountability and we have institutional accountability to groups of people that are in our democratic process electing their own leadership, and not like Elias because we know Elias, or Leslie or Aisha because we know, so it's a really different thing to move. The personal stories are important because that's how we were able to see the trends and where the levers are so important, but we can't get stuck there, because we get stuck there and it becomes like this sort of trauma porn thing where we're just like, exploiting other people's stories, but not doing anything structurally. And that we cannot afford to do anymore.
I want to name that throughout when you all started a blog, and I can't pinpoint right now when you started. So that, to me, I'm so excited for this book because I've read every single blog post you put out. I sent them to the board. I sent them to colleagues to say that, these blog posts are both naming the meta, but also saying, and here's what you can do in your congregations. And so for those waiting for the book or can't wait, go to the commission's blog. And every single blog post is on point, is helpful, and says, here's what you can do. So thank you for that genius, because it was like, oh, okay, this is where this is headed. And it already felt different. But now with COVID, for those who were like, oh, change is glacial. Well, apparently change isn't when you have a pandemic on your hands, and we could then do things that we never thought we could do on a dime. So we could bring change if we want to, but we have where there's a will, there's a way, right? So I also wanted to lift up your blog, which is excellent.
Elias is back, and Elias, you were going to just recap us from our last time, just to bridge where we were last time around a little bit about theology and like in some of our, kind of takeaways around theology, just a couple of the points, just to kind of reground us, because we want to always ground all of our work in our theology. That's been one of our core operating principles as a commission. And then we've got a couple other areas we thought we'd throw out there and just see where people want to go. But I'll go to Elias.
Yeah, I before I go into that, I posted on the chat the link to the blog. It is in the UUA under UUA governance/committees CIC blog, but it's there. I mean, there is so much that we can say about, and in particular, I can say about the theological piece, and I will try not to get too excited and stay to the point. But what I think, what I find, what we found challenging in this particular context as we're doing the work is that as a body of faith, we have a particular kind of allergy to doing theological thinking and practice, right? There is something about that engagement that we find it uncomfortable. And I would say primarily in our conversations, one of the things that we keep running into is the reality that a good part of the theological legacy that we have in terms of tradition, either sermons, right, or manifestos and the like, are largely either Christian, right, sort of Christian-centric, right, Christian Unitarians or Christian Universalists, or humanist, right, in nature. So after the 60s, right, you have very few kind of theological engagement with the tradition, right, and the modus of operation has been because it is either too Christian, right, or it is too humanist. So therefore, we don't engage either one of them. Right, we have what we have to do, right, for the MFC, right, for those looking into ordained ministry. We have some of the pieces that we do in terms of the Renaissance curriculum, but by and large, right, we don't go back to articulating what does this principle, this tradition means for the world today within our own sacred journeys, right? That requires a different kind of spiritual muscle that we have not exercised as much. Instead, what we have done is really center the self, right, center the individual and the individual spiritual journey, right, as the measure against we validate our faith experiences as a community, right? And that has become, in some ways, I'm going to dare to say, we have impoverished ourselves, right, as a tradition, because we are not sharpening our spiritual muscles, right, our intellectual muscles, our practice against a tradition. And again, this is not to fall into traditionalism, right, and say, the old folks were always right and correct as doctrine. No. It's as a way for us to think through, right, what are the challenges and the pieces that folks are thinking or thought about too important to communicate over time for us then to engage anew. And let me tell you, for our context, these are some of the ways in which that manifested itself, right? The call to beloved community, right? What does that actually mean in our community theologically, right, and spiritually, to say beloved community, right? It is the thing that we throw out there, right, oftentimes, but in the context of how does it challenge us to change, right, it is not clear, right? Even the principles, right? A lot of our folks do not understand the principle as being, I don't want to say necessarily theological mandates, right, but theological ideas for us to wrestle as a community, right? In fact, most UUs, I'm going to just say, don't oftentimes can name the 7 principles, right? We know the free and responsible search, right, and the democratic principle. Otherwise, right, folks get anxious for the other ones. And I think it's important, right, for us as a faith tradition, right, to understand, to become theological literate, right, in our community, and the kind of the theological literacy that we talk about is really understanding kind of faith in action, right? What is the impact of how to believe our faith and the grounding of our faith for how do we shape our communities? And that entails both, historical knowledge, right, and say the bookish pieces, but it also entails, right, the engagement with concrete problems. For example, we don't have doctrines of sin, right, and suffering, right? So how do we talk about salvation, right, and renewal, right, and accountability without some of that language, right? It becomes difficult, right, in our movement to do so. It's not impossible, right, but what is the language that we can use to hold each other into accountability when we miss the mark, right? A language of rituals, right? The ritual practices as a movement in this particular time, right? We don't have those things, right? We don't have books of common prayer, or whatever shape that may be. I've been looking through some of the old Unitarian book of prayers, right? They have beautiful sections of how to mourn the dead, right? We don't have that, and in our time that is so needed. And I'm there to say, right, some of our folks will be really uncomfortable, right, by engaging those texts that actually have them, because they are too Christian-centric, right, in the language of discourse. So then we have to engage them anew, right, to really equip our community to be able to do the faith work that we have to do to sustain and to nourish who we are as a faith community, not only for today, right, but for those that we're nurturing for tomorrow. So to recap, I think what we really intended to do in this engagement is really to put the understanding that we are a faith community, right, and that we have that theology and the experience of the sacred really should run our work, not only worship practice, but also in terms of justice and transformation, right? Those things are interconnected. So how do we connect them, not only in speech, but also in action, right, in service, and how do we guide our relationships?
And I just put in the chat some of the, like, we have a takeaway section at the end of every chapter in the book, and so in the report, and so I put a couple of the takeaways from the theology section that highlight what Elias was just saying, because I think it's important for us to keep remembering, like, and one of them that I think is really important is that freedom and individuality are not our most important values that we have to offer the world, especially not in these times when we need to think about the worth and dignity of all and our interdependence with one another, and that is a really different way to look at the foundation of our faith. So I think those are important as well. And one of the other areas that we were hoping to talk about today is the area of like that, you know, kind of feels like what we are having to make decisions about every moment in this time, right? Which is how to live our values, like what, and that has to do with, you know, when do we open up, when do we do what, who do we respect, who do we mourn, who do we honor, right? And, you know, so I was hoping that Sir might tell us a little bit of some of the takeaways from that area of what we have a section called Living Our Values, which focuses on that piece.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, of course, this is a perfect time for UUs to really live out into the world. I think that, so some of our takeaways, one of them was we need to ground our work in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think that this is especially crucial right now. As we can see, our world is extremely interdependent. So now we all have information on how, say, defunding healthcare in another country may affect our own country, for example. So we see how these inequities cause this kind of chaos and this kind of instability in our world. And it's extremely important for us to remember that, just as our second principle calls us to do, justice, equity, compassion, and human relations is key. If we are grounded, again, even in our first principle, the worth and dignity of every person, what does that say to this moment of who are we counting as in our community? Who are we counting as worthy? Who are we saying is disposable? So this is a perfect opportunity for us as UUs to put forth our principles as guidance for our actions. I think that so one of our other takeaways was we need accountability to organizations. And this is something I've been thinking a lot about, just in our, as Leslie said, in our daily lives. Who are we accountable to? We have to ask ourselves that, both as people who are, you know, everybody is on a spectrum of privilege. You know, myself as a cis hetero man, who am I accountable to when they're not in the room is something I always ask myself. You know, will I allow someone that I know to misgender someone else that I know without speaking up and saying something? So who are we accountable to has become a very kind of a key question for me. And I think that so one of our other takeaways is anti-oppression work must be a building block of all justice work. I think that this is a thing that is both, on one hand, to me, very, very simple. And yet I understand the complexities of it when folks, they bring up issues such as climate change, and they talk about, you know, we had a kind of a controversy in one of the first GAs I ever went to, where they chose, I think it was combating a corrupt democracy, and that was not understood to have as many racial nuances when we think about voter suppression and all these different things. So I think it's important for us as UUs, being a somewhat, I like to think of us as a somewhat intellectually driven faith. I think we have to sometimes ask ourselves, what data are we privileging and what data are we ignoring? When we have clear data that shows us that the number one and first folks affected by climate change, by these things like voter suppression, are Black, Indigenous, people of color, then we have to understand that when we talk about justice work as how it relates to everything, that we have to sort of, we have to privilege the experience of those who are most affected. And we have to see those experiences as a guide for how do we make life better for everyone. So I think this is a time that both challenges us, and yet it gives us an opportunity to really lead out what's special about Unitarian Universalism, what can be effective about it.
Yeah, I think particularly what you said about the ways in which we look at whose lives we value and who we feel is expendable is super important right now. You know, you mentioned, you know, what healthcare systems are we valuing and which are we defunding, and trying to get people to understand that from a place of faith and covenant as the theology of, we're not doing this because of the benefit that we get and the security that we get knowing that other healthcare systems are strong. We're doing this because as faith and covenant, we know we have a responsibility to those individual people to make sure that they are healthy and strong. And I think that's a shift, you know, for us, I think, as a faith, to really live into that theology of, if we're truly concerned about the other, then we're concerned about them no matter what. Like there aren't times in which their worth and value and dignity are less or more. They just are. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I love that you all are grounding your faith or your work in our theology, because I think, you know, I think you put in the takeaways that faith and covenant are not dirty words, and I would frame it as they're actually beautiful words, and they're words that we can truly be proud of and be grounded in and feel good about. And I think when we get there, it will feel good, and it will feel good that we're not just trying to take care of somebody else, but because of what it does for us.
So I have a question about, I guess, strategy, which maybe is its own show. I don't I don't know. Thankfully, you're coming back every other week for a little while. It seems to me, I'm sitting here going, yes, yes, yes. I am like on board with what what I'm hearing you say, but I knew that I would be. And it seems to me that essential to living our values is actually articulating what our values are. And I see freedom and individuality are not our most important values. And I am like, yes, like I've been preaching that since I started preaching, right? I'm good with that. And I am envisioning the people who are going to go, what? Sure they are. And so I'm wondering, do you have in your report ways to address that, or are we just going to start from the place of accepting that freedom and individuality are not our most important values? Like, what's the strategy here? Or is that not your job? Because that's okay too. Like, not everything has to be your job.
think it's a both and. It's all of our jobs, honestly. It's like a multi-and, not even both. So, but I think it's really critical. But that is actually why the whole point about like, faith and covenant are not dirty words. Well, that we know that, and yet we're also speaking to those people who think they are, right? Who think any traditional religious, which we tried very hard by taking the data that we had and using the methodologies that that Elias led us in with the using the tools that we had to analyze the data. We tried very hard to actually put forward information, right? So I think we have to be really clear. And I think this time of false news really shows it to us. We're guilty of false news in our own ranks, folks. And we know that, right? So how do we start using our discernment to understand, like to truly look at the patterns and say, these are actually things that are true, even if they challenge if they challenge me and if they make me uncomfortable, or if they take away something that, I'm really deeply committed to, or if they touch an old religious wound. We haven't even talked about that, but I think part of making this thing work is to actually have, as part of our congregations, regular practices to address the religious wounding that a lot of people have come into our midst with, and have, like, we need religious education or educators to be coming up with even new ways to look at that healing our religious past stuff. I run that curriculum twice a year in my congregation, every year, the adult ed curriculum around healing religious wounds. And we still, like, I'll tell you, we need more, right? And we need to not be just acting out of that woundedness, and let our discernment actually be discernment. And because sometimes we mask our woundedness as discernment, and that's not okay in these times, right? It's really important.
I would say briefly too, I'm reminded of a great article by Ibram Kendi put out recently, talking about the difference between the freedom to harm and the freedom to be from harm. I think that there is I don't know if I could call up the exact page or where it is in our report. Yeah, we do lift up some of these issues when we talk about like congregational polity and what does that really mean. And I think a lot of it, I found such a great summation in that quote, that we are really talking about when we talk about individual freedom, who is that freedom for? Who gets to hold that freedom? Who do we see as worthy of it, as entitled to it? And then what is that freedom that, and if we have this individual freedom, does that also mean that our communities should be places free from harm?
Leslie, what do you mean by, I'm sorry, Elias.
What I was going to add to that, to this conversation, is that we oftentimes fall into the trap of idolatrizing individualism, right? To the point that we do not hold individuals accountable to their impact within the system, right? And I think we can talk about the ways in which individuals have held congregations hostage for decades, right? And we dare not to have the conversation, right? Because we prioritize, right, the individual that might feel hurt or is uncomfortable versus the wellness of the community.
Sorry, I was talking at the same time, and that is such an important thing. I see that over and over in so many environments. But Leslie, I didn't quite understand your point about sometimes our woundedness masks as discernment. That's intriguing to me. Can you say more?
I mean, I think that we use, like Sir said, I mean, we are a culture that can be overly intellectualized because we have had deep wounding either to our identity, like, and I mean across the board. I'm not just talking about, in this case, people with marginalized identities. We have a lot of people that come into our midst because, who they were as a person who asked questions, or as a person that was data driven, or as a person who wanted to be a seeker in a different way, was not honored in their growing up experience, in their, they were a woman who didn't want to be in a traditional role, or there's lots of different ways that this gets expressed, but that woundedness then gets cloaked in this, kind of intellectualism, and it disconnects us from our emotional lives, our spiritual lives. We say faith is a bad word. Why are we trying to reclaim religious language? Why are we talking about covenant? And I want to just say, great comments in the chat about covenant, right? And about, yes, it's only a covenant if it actually is inclusive of everybody, not just a covenant that keeps people out, to Sir's amazing point that was just made, right? So I do think that we are carrying a lot of woundedness, and in that woundedness, we're masking it with intellectual theory and what's truth and and the power of reason, and we're keeping ourselves away from tools we need to survive. I'm sorry, but to be a believer in the goodness of humankind right now, to me, is a lot more improbable than a believer in God. I just want to say it from my personal vantage point. And I think that every time I go by a flagpole and those damn flags are all, not at half mast, how many people, more than 60,000 dead now. And we don't even have our flags at half mast, right? So I think we mask stuff that we shouldn't do under that guise.
Yeah, I think that comment about covenant, Achebe is in the comments saying that she agrees that the covenant is not dirty as long as it includes the experience of Black, Indigenous, people of color, particularly when we try and craft covenants that say we will speak directly with the other person when we're in times of disagreement. Oftentimes that then puts the burden of that interaction on people who are being wounded. And I think that covenantal agreement, that faith agreement, has to be inclusive enough that we understand that we first need to care for those who are harmed, and then have accountable discussions with those that are doing harm. And I think that yeah, I mean, that would be my experience of what I would see as beautiful covenant.
And I want to add something, because I think this is something that we encounter, that oftentimes when folks speak about coming back into covenant, what they expect is that things will go back to normal without the repair work. And sometimes part of the repair work is understanding that the relationship is broken, right? That there is forgiveness, but that does not mean that we will enter back into the same kind of relationship that before, right? And who gets to decide that, right, is the one that suffer the impact the most, right?
Well, and I think it's important also to name that part of white supremacy culture is equating "you have harmed me" with "I disagree with you," right? So like we can speak directly with someone when we disagree with them is not the same as we have to confront people who are actively harming us. I mean, it's not the same. And our systems want to make them the same because it minimizes the harm that's being done to marginalized people.
Yeah, because I think that the idea that harm is something that makes you feel bad is kind of rampant right now. And when Black, Indigenous, people of color communities are talking about harm, we're talking about harm. We're talking about physical harm. We're talking about the safety of our children. We're talking about the care of our elders. We're talking about harm, and we may be talking about it in the ways that it is expressing itself in that moment. It may not be physical harm, but what we're saying is this is what allows that physical harm to happen in the wider world, and we need you all to circle, to gather yourselves up and stop it, because this is what perpetuates that ability for that real life-endangering harm to occur. So thank you, Michael, for trying to, help us talk about the difference that we're going to get. We've had great conversations today. Wow, wide-ranging. Thank you so much. The commission will be back in 2 weeks. Thank you. I think it's 2 weeks. Don't hold me to that. We'll check our schedule. But next week we have the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association here, to representatives to talk about the UUMA guidelines revisions that are being proposed. So we will have Melissa Carville-Zemer, Julica Herman de la Fuente, and Matthew Johnson here to have a great conversation about that. Until then, just blessings of hope and peace and health on everyone. And remember to check in on your neighbor.